Biological Realist, a podcast dedicated to exploring the impact of evolution on human mind and society. And before getting to today's show, I'd like to take a few moments to encourage you to support the podcast. There's a few ways you can do this. One is to simply buy any Amazon product through the widgets that you see there on the site. Particularly, I'll draw your attention to that little bar that pops up from the bottom of the screen. So any book that you hear discussed on the show that you'd like to buy, or any other book, or any other product that you'd like to buy on Amazon, by buying it through that link, you can, at no extra cost to yourself, you pay the same thing as whether you bought it there or went directly to Amazon, but you create commissions for the show that allows us to keep it on the air. So that would be really helpful if you could do that. The other thing is that, of course, there's opportunities to make donations to the show. We have several options there. You should be able to see a PayPal donation button and Bitcoin for those who use Bitcoin, and coming soon we'll also have a Patreon campaign. So lots of options to be able to make donations. So any of these things that you can do to help us generate the revenues we need to keep the show on the air would be much appreciated. So that's it for now, and let's get to today's episode. Hello, I'm Michael McConkie, host of the Biological Realist podcast. And today, I'm joined by Aaron Sell, who is Professor of Criminology at Griffith University, Mount Gravatt, Australia. So, hail the Commonwealth, and Aaron, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you.
So, today we're going to be talking about work you've done around questions of anger as an adaptation, its evolutionary benefits and issues related to that. But I think of all the shows I've done so far in the early going here, the work you've done is most solidly grounded in the, I guess what people are calling now the Santa Barbara School of Evolutionary Psychology. So I thought it might be useful if you could to give us sort of a introductory 101 sketch of the sort of conceptual foundations of that school, and then maybe that can segue us into your research. How's that sound?
Sure, that's no problem. So, yeah, the Santa Barbara School is, or UC Santa Barbara, has within it the Center for Evolutionary Psychology, which was founded by John Tooby and Lita Cosmides. They're my PhD advisors, and they're generally considered the sort of theoretical leaders in evolutionary psychology. When you open a textbook on evolutionary psychology, they'll give a kind of brief overview of their theories. And it came largely out of the anthropology departments at Harvard, where Irv DeVore and others were located. And yeah, the basic premise is you take the central points of evolutionary biology and you basically just import them into psychology and add a little bit on top of that. And so what the Santa Barbara School maintains is that some things are undeniable. Evolution takes a long time to work. And so the human mind, like every other organ of every other species on the planet, evolved by natural selection, that it has a function, namely to coordinate muscle movement and make that muscles contingent on what your senses import. So, I mean, if you just analyze the nervous system, that's what it does, right? It connects sensory neurons to interneurons to motor neurons. And their claims, the claims that sometimes people will disagree with, but I think they're on extremely solid ground, are that the brain is, to a large extent, specialized, that you have different parts of your brain that are specialized for different functions. And everyone in psychology more or less grants that for language and for the senses. So everyone recognizes the occipital lobe is specialized for vision, the V4 section is specialized for color vision, there's a different section for detecting motion, and so that's all more or less granted. And to a large extent, language is granted as well, that there are specialized sections of the brain designed for language. And Tooby and Cosmides maintain that this is, that we're underestimating it, that it's much more specialized than that we're going to have sections, not just for anger, but for small parts of anger that were specifically designed by natural selection. We'll probably get to some of that data later. But they hold that for all kinds of aspects of the mind, and that most actually of what we think of as the world around us is actually an interpretation done by specialized mechanisms designed by evolution. So You look at the grass looks green. Everyone takes that to be true. It's not. There's no color in grass. Grass reflects wavelengths of various lengths and amplitudes, and so the brain, the retina, that impacts on the retina will create a neural code. That neural code leads to the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe hallucinates the color of green. Different animals will see grass in different colors. And so that's just an example of, how what looks to be real in the world is actually the output of these specialized mechanisms. And it goes all the way up. It goes to, to morality, right? You look at something and you think, well, this person's punching a baby. That's immoral and evil. That's just a fact of the world. There's evilness there. Well, no, I mean, that's a category that the human brain puts that behavior in. And I'm one such human, but nonetheless, it's not. A different species could have, in theory, a completely different moral system. And it's not that ours is right and theirs is wrong. They're just two different ways of looking at, of categorizing the world. And so, yeah, their main point is that the brain is specialized, that it's designed for this ancestral environment, and so we live in a very kind of weird world, right, where we have conversations where we can't see each other's faces across oceans, right? That's never happened in the past. You meet countless strangers, and they're not dangerous. I mean, these are things that ancestrally we weren't really built for. So one of the tenets they have, and it's shared with evolutionary biology generally, is that animals are designed for their ancestral environments. And so a lot of what we do is try to interpret human behavior based on the mechanisms that create it, recognizing that those mechanisms were designed ancestrally. So that's kind of a brief sketch of their basic approach. And I think most evolutionary psychologists agree with all of that, actually. They sometimes quibble about exactly, how much has our brain changed in the last 10,000 years, for example, since agriculture. And Tooby and Cosmides would maintain, well, not so much, right? Some, but and then there's fights about exactly how much, but nobody denies that evolution takes a long time to work, and so many of the mechanisms that constitute human nature were designed for ancestral environments.
Yeah, and I guess one of the, another controversial issue, or to some degree, anyways, is the question of adaptation. I guess there's an accusation sometimes that some in the evolutionary psychology tradition overemphasize, or see, this is almost like, I guess, the Stephen Gould type accusation, right? That everything's an adaptation. Come on, not everything, But well, first of all, I don't know how accurate that is. But the other thing, it seems to me key to the whole evolutionary psychology approach is that all these mental, let's call them modules or mechanisms, for lack of a better word, really had to be sculpted by evolution if they were going to provide us fitness benefits, right? So that's sort of the underlying thing here, is that all these tools of the Swiss Army knife, as sometimes is the metaphor, all had to be sculpted to provide some kind of benefit, or they wouldn't have been inherited through the lineages of our species. Is that right?
That is. There's the philosophy of kind of evolutionary psychology draws heavily from George Williams' work. George Williams is a brilliant biologist. He published a book called Adaptation and Natural Selection in 1966. And yeah, he did some really, he wrote kind of Gould's theories before Gould did and wrote them better. I don't really know why anyone bothers. But yeah, so he distinguished between what he called adaptations, which are these things that natural selection has tailored, that gene after gene after gene has popped up randomly, but because they provided fitness benefits, they increase their own reproduction, and they're pushed to fixation. And if that happens often enough, what you have is the beginning of design. I mean, this is actually what life is. Life isn't made of any different stuff, right? It's made out of dead stuff. It's made out of carbon, water, and so on. But the extent to which carbon and water becomes organized into complex machinery, we call that life. And that process is done by natural selection. It's the only process, it's the only part of evolution that can give rise to complex functional design. No one's ever found another one unless you want to use creationism or something. And so if you're looking at complex functional design in an organism, this is the only theory you have. It's either the natural selection designed that, or it designed a kind of learning mechanism that generates these kinds of complex behaviors. So just to give a quick example of that, if you look at an animal's foraging patterns, bees don't forage randomly, birds don't forage randomly, they don't just fly in random directions. They have a very complex, organized system of how to forage. And so if you actually looked at the pattern that they use, it's complex, it's functional, but it's designed for the environment they're currently in, their immediate situation, right? They go around that hill rather than over it and so forth. And so an individual ant's individual pattern isn't specifically tailored by natural selection, but what is the learning mechanism that ant has that enables it to determine what's the most efficient route to get from point A to point B and back again, taking into account potential predators and so forth. And so that's an adaptation. It's a complex function. It can encompass all the emotions, all the organs, and one adaptation can break down into multiple adaptations. So you can take the eye, which is an adaptation, but it has within it the iris, which is also an adaptation. Right? And then Williams said, okay, there's those, and then there's the byproducts of all of those. And so, humans, for example, will store fat. As a byproduct of this, our bodies are flammable. And it's not that, humans evolved to be flammable, because flammable humans out-reproduced humans who, stubbornly resisted fire. It's that, those that stored fat outlived those who never did, right? And so, as a result, as a byproduct, he would say, we became flammable. Gould then later used the term spandrels as opposed to byproducts, which is more fancy and kind of showy, but it means exactly the same thing. And then there's a third category, which is kind of noise, which is just, the chaotic forces of the universe wrecking your body, so, the radiation causing mutations and so forth, and just abnormalities, injuries, and so those sorts of things. And so, Williams not only made these distinctions before Gould, he actually explained why you would go with one over the other. So he said, if you want to know whether something's an adaptation, here's the burden of proof you have to meet. If you can meet this, we'll take it seriously. To the extent that you can't meet this, then your theory is likely incorrect. And he said the burden is this. You have to show complex, in other words, multiple features, and they have to be designed, or not consciously designed, but give the illusion of design towards some designed to solve a kind of ancestral problem or an adaptive problem. So we'll get to this when we talk, presumably if we get to the anger face, about, this is the kind of burden that my theory for the anger face has to meet. You can't just say that, people with trait X increase reproduction, therefore trait X evolved. You have to show all the features of X. So the example I give in my course is the eyebrows, which is, no one's ever published, but there's a paper here, I swear it. Like, how do you actually know what the function of the eyebrows is? It looks like it traps water and sweat from your eyes, right? But it could be to reflect rays from the sun, right? Football players will put black lines in their eyes to do that. There could be different features. It could be a byproduct, right? It could just be an accident. So how do you know what the function of the eyebrows is? And the answer is you have to look for features of them, right? So the kinds of features that indicate that the eyebrows are actually very well designed for keeping liquid out of your eyes. So one comes to mind, right? There's two of them, one for each eye. That would have to be a coincidence. The hairs on the eyebrows actually run horizontally rather than up and down, which is how most of the hair on your face and other parts of your body run. And horizontal hair, of course, would allow the water to traverse, left and right, as opposed to straight. And if the hairs went up and down, water would hit it and go down the hairs or right into your eyeball. It's at the exact wrong angle for that, right? It would have to be a coincidence that they're horizontal. There's a gap in the middle, and there's a gap on the sides to let water run down. That would have to be a coincidence. They're right on the ridge of the brow, right? So they're not midway up the forehead where water would get underneath, but they're not right underneath or right on top of the eyelid either. And so they're actually right at the point where the water would need to be moved away before it gets into the eye socket. That would have to be a coincidence. And the more of these you pile up, right, the more coincidences that would be required, the less likely it is that that's the case. Right? It's basic hypothesis testing. And so what Williams would conclude, I'm sure, I imagine I could make a good case for him, is that the eyebrows have all these features. They're all designed for the same thing, and therefore it's extremely likely that they were evolved by natural selection, because humans with differently shaped eyebrows died or failed to hunt effectively or otherwise compromised their vision. And so that's actually how you prove it, something Gould didn't really understand. He never gave a way of testing whether something was a spandrel or not. He just said it's a big problem, and you'd have to call him to have him tell you.
Right. That's a good point, actually.
And that's a fun example. I've never heard that example before. That's a fun example. Yeah, the Williams book is a great book. I'm going to put a link to that in the show notes because that's a wonderful book. And
Yeah.
for people not familiar with the literature, will find it surprisingly readable. It's a very accessible book, really insightful. So with that background, then, I suppose this is a good time to segue into your work. So let me put it to you: why should we believe that anger is an adaptation, and an adaptation for what? What's the fitness payoff?
Oh, okay. Well, I'll start this in reverse order if it's all right.
Sure.
My theory holds that anger is designed by natural selection to bargain for better treatment, and so the ultimate selection pressure that anger's evolved to deal with is the fact that humans and other animals have conflicts of interest, where I want to do one thing or I'm designed to do one thing and you're designed to do something that's incompatible with that. I want to eat the food and you want to eat the food, and you eating the food prevents me from doing it. Right? So how's that resolved? And if you trace it through evolutionary biology, it's an extremely common problem for animals, or a lesser problem for plants, but still there. But for animals, yeah, very common problem. So how do you resolve it? Well, one typical way is to simply disorder the other organism, right? So I disconnect your spine, and now I can eat the apple, and there's nothing you can do about it. And so this is basically the root of quite a bit of conspecific aggression, right? Even things like predation, where I want to eat you and you don't want to be eaten, and so forth. And so out of that comes a whole host of adaptations in other animals that we have a reasonably good understanding of. I mean, science is ongoing and so forth. But evolutionary biologists can agree on what aggression is. It's a tool designed by natural selection. They can agree that it's deployed very frequently to bargain for better treatment. One animal's attempt to make the other animal defer to them more, to grant them a larger territory, to let them have access to a mate or a food item or so forth. They have a really good understanding of that. When it comes to psychology, you'll get 10 different answers for what aggression is from 10 different researchers. But evolutionary psychology is good in the sense that it takes the evolutionary biology of that seriously. And so one of the things that anger does is govern aggressive behavior. It's not the only thing it does, and it very rarely does that. Most incidents of anger are resolved without even threats of aggression, let alone actual aggression. But it occurs primarily during these conflicts of interest, where you want one thing, someone else wants something incompatible with that, and people get angry. And so what I claim is that the adaptation of anger functions to bargain for better treatment in these contexts, and it does it on two different stages. The first is bargaining about an individual resource. I want to go see, I don't know, the Captain America movie, and my wife wants to see some terrible romantic comedy, and so we have to fight about that.
Okay.
And it's not violent. Nobody ever threatens anything. There's never a sense of like, well, I'm just never going to speak to you again because how dare you make me watch that movie. It's a very low-level kind of anger. This is hypothetical. My wife and I almost never fight, but in case this spreads around.
Okay.
But yeah, that would be stage one kind of anger. There's a conflict of interest. I want to see this. She doesn't. She wants to see that. I don't. And then there's stage two anger, which is bargaining over kind of internal calibration of one person's valuation of another. So roughly, in human terms, it would be respect. And this is a much more dangerous kind of anger because you're not fighting over an incident. You're fighting over what's in that person's head and how much they respect you from this point and further. Right? So the goal of that is to recalibrate their estimation of you, which means you can't just point out how bad the movie is. You have to make arguments like, you don't respect me, and you need to. Right? And those kind of arguments are often demonstrated, and we'll probably get to this, either by aggression or through the withholding of cooperation through other means. So that's essentially what I think anger does. The reason I think it should be taken seriously as an adaptation is it has all of the kind of hallmarks of that, all the kind of predictors of how you're dealing with an adaptation. So the absolute best is George Williams, which is that it has complex functional design. You see multiple features of anger. It's triggered by conflicts of interest. It pops up in those contexts. The arguments that it deploys are consistent with that. Roughly things like, I need this a lot and you don't need it that much, and I'm tough and you're weak, and you need me and I don't need you, and just a litany of things that are non-randomly related to the fact that you were bargaining for better interest. You have features like the anger face, which not only is a adaptation in itself, but you see these sorts of things arising relatively early in life and without the required input to learn it through a more general mechanism. So the alternative of anger being an adaptation would have to be something like there's a higher order adaptation, a kind of emotional adaptation, and that it generates anger in individuals, but anger wasn't specifically tailored by natural selection, right? So that you could get different emotions with different inputs. And we can safely rule that out because there's some really interesting data on, for example, blind children producing normal anger expressions. So these are children who've never seen an anger face, but they make one, right? And they have it with all the different components. And so it's different from chimpanzee expression, so it really was tailored for our lineage. People with this face out-reproduce those who made different ones. And right, so that's just, the anger face is the easiest. It's the easiest to see. It's the easiest to document. It gets a lot of different, lot of attention, and we can all sort of agree on what it looks like. And so I find that to be one of the most convenient data points. But the real evidence is that anger is extremely well designed. It has multiple features for bringing these sorts of things about. And a lot of my research has just been on kind of documenting these features of anger and how each of them is well designed, like the eyebrows. Each one has that same function, which is bargaining for better treatment.
Yeah, there's this slogan. I think it's from The Art of War. It's something like politics is war by other means or something. And I'm just, as you're talking, I'm wondering, is anger aggression or violence by other means? Is it a way to sort of get one's get what one wants without engaging in the risky activity of actually engaging in physical violence? Is that an accurate interpretation?
But that is a component of both animal bargaining aggression and anger, which is I'm going to get angry, but before I actually hurt you, I'm going to show you how tough I am, and then you're going to back down and I won't have to pay the cost of actually hurting you. That's a big part of anger-based aggression. But anger actually, it would be wrong to simplify anger to that, because the way anger works, you bargain through a lot of different methods, and so humans are an extremely cooperative species. That we depend on each other, right? And we value each other to the extent that others can deliver us benefits. Somebody saves your child's life, you like them, right? That's just what happens. And it happens for good reason, right? People who ignored people and said, well, I don't care if you save my child's life, right? That guy lost his child the next time. And so it's part of human nature to benefit people and to like people and to help people who have helped us in the past. And so anger can use that, for example, to bargain. So if my wife and I did get into a fight about the new Captain America movie or whatever it is, and it escalated, right, it wouldn't become violent. It would be something along the lines of, well, fine, then I'm not going to, make you breakfast before you go to work, and I'm not going to, record your television chat or whatever. We just start, rescinding the nice things we do for each other as a kind of a bargaining chip. It's actually much more common than aggression is in anger. So James Averill's a very influential psychologist, did research on anger, and he just asked people, when's the last time you were angry? What was it about? And anger, explicit threats of violence or violence itself, not implicit threats of violence, but explicit threats of violence or violence only occurred in 3% of the cases that the people reported. Violence is rare for anger. Anger kind of uses it maybe as a last resort, but usually it uses it in contexts where other means of bargaining aren't available. Right? So it's easier to temporarily deny a benefit to someone, to say, well, fine, I'm just not going to help you. If you're going to treat me that way, I'm not going to review your papers, I'm not going to give you advice, I'm not going to remind you that your grant is due. You're being rude to me, so I'm just not going to do all these nice things for you. That's sort of what anger does more frequently than aggression. And it works by the same principles, which is, if your colleague's angry at you and he rescinds all these benefits he's giving, that is a kind of cost on you. We wouldn't call it aggression because it's kind of not affirmatively disordering you, but it is inflicting costs on you, right, by denying you benefits, right? The math of, positive and negative is roughly the same. The impact on you is your life is worse because he's not helping you. But it's really not aggression. Like, you wouldn't classify that as aggression. It's denying benefits. And it works because that person then realizes, wow, my life is actually really bad without that person. And so what I need to do is give them a little bit more respect. I need to adjust recalibrate my mental structure so that they receive more benefits in the future and I treat them better. And once you do that, anger turns off. It's another feature of anger that demonstrates its function, which is that when you recalibrate and apologize to someone, anger almost always goes away. That's another one of the things that Averill noticed, was that heartfelt apologies work, and they work extremely well until if you abuse them, they stop working. But
Right.
but yeah, it illustrates the point, right? What's the point of anger if an apology gets rid of it? Like, there were theories that the function of anger is to punish people, and that's just not right. Anger isn't punishing people in most of the cases, and in addition to that, right, if a person apologizes, they haven't been punished, right? Nothing really bad has happened to them. They're just illustrating, I've changed my mind, you're right, I'm wrong, I won't do this to you anymore, and I shouldn't have done it then. You say that to someone, anger almost always goes away, and yet they have nothing damaging really happened to them, right?
Yeah. But so it sounds the way you're describing it, though, that threat is an essential component of it. Like, is that correct?
Well, not an aggressive threat.
Well, but yeah, okay, not aggressive, right. but even social threat, right? Like if I'm not going to do nice, I'm not going to, do something nice for my wife, or whatever, right? I mean, there's a threat in that too, right? So.
Yeah, sure. If you include the denial of benefits and the threats of denial of benefits, that is definitely true for stage 2 anger. It's possible to have an entire argument, though, in stage 1, for example, where you're arguing about, a course of action or a potential course of action, or, something that we've done that isn't really about you respecting me and not about me respecting you, but it's about, I really don't want to eat there anymore, that place sucked, that sort of thing.
Right.
You can have a whole argument about that, and it can be angry without there ever really being threats. Because what you're arguing about is whether we go back to that restaurant or not. And that can escalate, right? If you say something like, I don't care what you think, I'm never eating there again, and there's nothing you can do, well, then it will quickly become, escalate to stage 2. But, so I think threats are an essential component of anger, but again, you can have the early parts of bargaining without any of those.
Okay, so I guess focusing on the second stage, the respect element here, you've developed this idea of a welfare trade-off ratio. Would you like to explain to the listeners what this is and how this factors into the story around anger?
Sure. It was the welfare trade-off ratio is this. It's another adaptation that humans have that solves the following adaptive problem, which is that you need to defer to other people in your environment to different extents. Right? So, the president shows up, you got to treat him with a little bit more respect than if a homeless man does, and so forth. If a big guy shows up and demands something, you treat it differently than if a small guy does. Beautiful woman versus unattractive woman, down the list. Right? And so there's many different aspects, many different variables that humans use to determine how much to kind of suffer for someone else's benefit. Right? Kinship being another big one. And all of these sort of need to be integrated to make an actual decision. So just to give you an example of kind of how the origin of this line of thinking, when you study kinship, evolutionary biologists will tell you, okay, that if you're related to someone, you need to benefit them in a certain ratio. You would be designed by natural selection to benefit them at a certain ratio of yourself. So a full brother has half of your genes in common by recent common descent. You'd benefit to treat him as, half as valuable as yourself, right? If you can benefit him 5 at a cost of 2 for yourself, you should do that. Evolution would design you to do that if it were recurrent. And so a different researcher studying, reciprocity would say, well, you should, benefit this person if they've helped you in the past. And a different person studying aggression and formidability would say, well, if they're tougher than you, you have to help them, right? And so then what does an actual individual organism do? What does an actual human or other animal do when they're dealing with their brother, but their brother's weaker than them, but he's reciprocated recently in the past? Like, you have all 3 of these variables all at once. And so what does the animal do, right? Researchers can study them one at a time, but animals can't. They actually have to do something. And so the notion is that these different indices, like the kinship index, how related you are, reciprocity, formidability, these need to be integrated into some kind of decision mechanism that animals use that basically sets how much I value this other individual compared to myself when it comes time to make a decision. And so this is what we call the welfare trade-off ratio. It's to what extent are you going to trade off on your own welfare to benefit this other person, and vice versa, how much you'll trade off their welfare to benefit yourself. And the idea is that we have different welfare trade-off ratios for different people. So we all have a high welfare trade-off ratio for our children, presumably high for our spouses, for our friends, high for our bosses, a very temporarily high welfare trade-off ratios for strangers with weapons making demands and so forth. And we all, more or less universally, have an extremely low welfare trade-off ratio towards, North Koreans. Nobody seems to care that they're suffering and dying, and that they've eaten all their pets and they're moving on to tree bark and their children, and nobody cares. It's kind of disturbing. It's the example I use. But yeah, I mean, that's close to zero, right? A true zero welfare trade-off ratio is where the other impact of your actions on this other person are completely unimportant to you. You just don't care. So it's not rage and hatred. Hatred is more of a negative welfare trade-off ratio where you want to hurt them. The best example I can think of of a zero welfare trade-off ratio was this video of a Nazi doctor who was putting a captive Jew into a water tank, essentially, and filled with ice, and they were basically testing out at what temperature humans die from cold, because they were, planning this attack in Siberia, and they needed to know this sort of thing. And the doctor was just kind of directing him in. It wasn't like, haha, I hate you, I'm going to throw you in here, you killed Christ, I got you now, that sort of. There was none of that. It was just, okay, this mass needs to get into this thing here of water, right? It was a complete disinterest in their welfare. And so, I mean, it feels very much like evil when you see it. It's the, they're on fire, what does that mean to me, kind of attitude. Anyway, so that's what the welfare trade-off ratio, we think, is. And it evolved because the individual organism needs to coordinate these things. Now, the reason it relates to anger is that anger, we believe, in particular stage 2 anger, is primarily designed to kind of raise the welfare trade-off ratio. And you can see this by the triggers of anger, by what causes anger, by the fact that apologies extinguish it, and what people do when angry. That seems kind of non-randomly designed to get people to value you more. And so when you look at the logic of like what sets welfare trade-off ratios, how is it, who do we value, and for what reasons, that just happens to be what anger does. That just happens to be what anger demonstrates when it's turned on. If you get a person really angry and they're bargaining for better treatment, they just start giving you information that hypothetically should set your welfare trade-off ratio. Right? They say things like, I'm a human being worthy of value. I'm your brother. How can you treat me this way? They can say, I'm tougher than you. I can kick your ass. You don't know who you're messing with. You should ask Bob what happened to him when he turned on me. That sort of thing. They give you all the reasons that they benefited you in the past, because again, we value people who treat us well, right? You're going to treat me like this after I saved your daughter's life. You're going to treat me like this after I just got done helping you. Good luck writing your next paper without my stats expertise. All of these litany of this kind of barrage of information that, if believed, would raise welfare trade-off ratios, would make the person recognize, oh, I treated this person bad, and yet I shouldn't, because he's my brother, he's helped me a lot in the past, he can kick my ass, my wife is highly dependent on him, he can really hurt me if he gets angry, and so on. And so the welfare trade-off ratio essentially is the target of stage 2 anger. It's the thing that anger is designed to recalibrate in the target. And that's why when a person apologizes, indicating that they made a mistake and they will value you more from now on, anger turns off. It's like, okay, it's done now. That's the point of anger.
Okay. So that's okay. So we're all walking around with this this adaptation to evaluate whether other people are the way they act towards us, how we perceive it affects our welfare, how it that's not quite right. How it's I've been told I need to summarize more when I do these shows, so that's what I'm trying to do. But I'm struggling right now.
I could give it a shot if you'd like.
Well, let me try. Let me try though. Okay. Because a lot of the listeners are probably like me, trying to put it together, right? So we're all walking around with this mechanism in which we're evaluating the way other people are treating us, and we're determining. Obviously, this is all happening unconsciously, right, through evolved unconscious mechanisms, and we're evaluating whether we're being treated properly with respect. And if we determine that someone is not giving us the respect that we think we're due, then one possible response to that is stage 2 anger. Is this correct?
Right. Yeah, that's exactly correct. I mean, there's some additional detail. Like the early stages of anger are often inquisitory. Did I really see that? Is he really treating me like that?
Right.
You don't want to misfire and jump to stage 2 anger before you check your data. But no, that's exactly right. That's if you think, I actually tried to make a list once, and I'm still kind of adding to it, so I haven't published it yet, but of all the different ways to trigger anger, and I've got about 16 or so that are just computationally distinct. They're just different ways of triggering it. And they all kind of relate back to this notion of respect. It's kind of, if you wanted to program a computer to know what respect is, what would you have to put into it? And I'd say at a minimum you need these 13 things. So just one of them is really simple, right? Forgetting things about people. Right? People get angry when someone forgets something about you, which for many theories of anger just makes no sense, right? The frustration aggression model cannot explain this. But it's a very common source of anger. Forgetting anniversaries, forgetting birthdays, forgetting people's names after you meet them several times, because it indicates that you don't value the person very highly. On the assumption, this assumes, which I think is accurate, but I still haven't seen anyone test, that we remember more information about people that we find important. That people we respect, we should remember more information than people that we don't respect.
Right.
And assuming that's true, then people forgetting things about you indicates a lower level of respect. In the same sense that somebody remembering you is flattering.
Yeah, and I think that's, for what it's worth as data point, I think that probably a lot of people would acknowledge that, right? You feel someone who should remember something about you don't. People do feel disrespected, right? So
Yeah, absolutely. I'm putting it out there. Anyone wants to run a study where they demonstrate that the people that we respect, we remember with higher fidelity, I will cite you a lot. That's all I'm saying.
So this could sound like now. So we sound like, we've got an easy solution. People disrespect us. I can respond with anger, and they'll recalculate and treat me with more respect. But it's not that simple. And you have this other area of research you've been focusing on, which I think you call formidability assessment, that complicates this story quite a bit. So do you want to explain to us how that fits in?
Sure. This was I started as a very simple kind of, I'll just run this and be done with it kind of project, and then it just keeps on growing against my better wishes. But I'm basically just stealing from evolutionary biology. Evolutionary biologists know that animals size up their opponents, right? And it's part of the same kind of bargaining aggression that was what I think is the precursor of human anger, which is, two animals come upon, let's say, a piece of food, and they have to decide who gets it. And obviously, this is a conflict of interest. They both want it. And so they have to make a decision, is this worth fighting for? And evolution is very rational in the sense that, whatever genes spread will spread, right? And that's nature selecting for it. And so what kind of genes would spread based on their effects in this context? And the answer is, well, the ones that will spread are the ones where the animal makes a decision to fight if the benefits of fighting outweigh the costs of fighting. The benefits of fighting are they have a non-zero chance of getting the resource. The costs of fighting are they might get injured during the fight. And it turns out, the variables that impact this, some of the most important, are the formidabilities of the two animals involved. Right? If you're a giant and the other one's tiny, then the cost of fighting is going to be small and the benefits can be high because there's almost a perfect chance of you winning the fight. And so, not surprisingly, animals size up their opponents. They do it in advance. And they'll do it during aggression too, but you'll see this, some classic works on things like red deer will make little roars, and it signals their body size, and you can record that and play it to other deer, and you'll see the small ones run away, and the bigger ones will still come forward. You'll see visual assessments. You'll see the bearing of fangs and so on, which would only really work if animals were assessing fang length. And so I said, simple prediction, right? Humans ought to be able to size each other up too. They ought to be particularly good at sizing up males because males are the ones who are using the most aggression. And so I just, had some photographs of some males I had brought to the gym. So we got pictures of, male bodies, male faces. We had recordings of male voices. And I kind of got them from all around the world and showed them or played them to subjects in the U.S. and had them estimate, how strong do you think these guys are? And it's a fairly obvious result, but it was an important one, which is, yeah, people can do this. You can look at a man's body and you can estimate with really good accuracy how strong he is. You can look at his face and estimate with pretty good accuracy how strong he is. And you can listen to his voice and with pretty good accuracy estimate how strong he is. So, and there's some additional details that really show it as an adaptation, like the kinds of strength that they're assessing, namely upper body strength more than lower body strength, and physical strength more than height or weight, and so forth. And it really looks like it is an adaptation, something that's specifically tailored to pick up on the cues that indicate this person can hurt me. And that's a really important variable, one in its own right, but also because it relates to anger, particularly that you have to respect people who can hurt you more than people who can't hurt you. And so people become very, during anger, people size each other up as well, right? Imagine two guys in a bar fight that, a kind of violent anger where aggression is going to be likely. You can't tell the guy in the bar, well, I'm not going to treat you with respect either then, or I'm not going to help you on your grant, if you don't ever write grants together, right? All you really have to bargain with then, with the stranger, is your formidability. And so, well, you can appeal to future benefits, but, formidability is the main one in that context. And so, yeah, they size each other up, right? They look each other in the eye, they push and shove a little bit. That's not going to beat anyone. No one's ever been pushed and, well, okay, that's not true. But few people have been pushed and died from it, especially in a bar, not near a cliff. And so, yeah, this is a kind of aggression that indicates strength, right? The point of a push is not to incapacitate the target. It's to show them, look, this is how strong I am. You better back off. Look how hard I can push. And so, anyway, the aggression becomes, at some point, an extension of these assessment mechanisms. So it starts off by looking at a guy's face and saying, he doesn't look that tough, or looking at him standing as tall as he can and think he still looks kind of short. And then it becomes, he pushed me, but that wasn't that hard. And, and then that becomes, he punched me and it wasn't that bad, And then at the end of this, there's guns and strangling and so on, eye gouging. But that's at the very late ends of aggression. Most fights between two strangers in a bar don't involve, eye gouging and choking and weaponry and so on.
So this is interesting to me because I'm going to give you a slant on it. I don't know if this is the way you see it or not. From what I've read of you or heard of you speak about this, I haven't heard you put it just this way, but maybe you've been thinking about it this way. I mean, my lens, or one of my lenses through which I view this stuff, is my PhD is actually in communications theory, and for the listeners who may not know this, there are some famous papers written in the, I can't remember, late 70s, early 80s by Krebs and Dawkins about animal communication and the manipulativeness of animal communication and this idea of arms races, so that one animal would develop the capacity to send a signal that could manipulate another animal, but then the animal being manipulated would in turn eventually evolve capacities to be able to discount that signal and not be taken in by it and therefore not be manipulated by it. And that sounds to me a little bit like what's going on here. Like, if anger were effective at potentially intimidating someone so that the angry person could get the resources or the mating opportunities or whatever that they wanted, this would be a big advantage. So, it could be kind of an arms race story in that those who are the subject of the anger would develop the capacity to be able to say, oh, wait a minute, this guy's not that formidable. I don't have to be afraid of him, right? So, you think that something like that may be part of the explanation for what's going on here?
Well, I think so. I mean, arms races usually refer to cases where, you evolve one thing, and then I have to evolve something to counter it, and then you evolve something to counter that, and I evolve something to counter it.
Yeah, an ongoing thing, yeah.
Right. So I think, and in particular, the signaling data. The signaling data highlights a kind of a problem for evolutionary biologists, which is that they often interpret the function of a signal as simply to send the signal. And some of Dawkins and Krebs and others, their reasoning, which is very bright, is that if the signal's cooperative, that's very easy to do. So if you need to give an alarm call as a squirrel to say, hey, there's a hawk over there, everybody run back into your holes, that signal is sent by someone who wants to send it, and it's received by someone who wants to receive it. So it can be very rapid. It can be very short. It can be very, to the point. It can just be, a loud screech. On the other hand, there are different kinds of signals that are kind of intended to manipulate the target, and the target often resists the manipulation, so the signals look differently. So a classic example would be something like a baby crying, right? That's not a simple thing. It's not, I'm hungry, and then stops, right? It's very different. It's ongoing. It's as loud as it can be. It's an attempt, it's seen as a kind of an attempt to manipulate the target. And so in terms of the anger expression, so when people get angry, certain things about them change, right? And it's not random. The things that change are the things that make them sound and look more formidable. So this is kind of where the anger and the formidability data research overlap where, so for example, what does a person do with their body when they're angry and when they get physically violent? So if you're angry and you're fighting again with friends or spouses or something, and you're not going to hurt them, you're not going to threaten to hurt them, then you don't demonstrate these. But imagine in the middle of an argument with a colleague, he stood up, stood really tall, stretched his neck out a bit, put his legs together so he was as tall as he could, puffed his chest out, and his arms kind of broadened his arms just a bit. Right? This is no longer an argument, a friendly argument. It's not even an angry argument. This is a dangerous stage 2 anger argument. He's showing you that he can kick your ass by standing taller, right? And so that kind of a signal, like what is that actually sending? Now, it's sending a signal. It's making the person look as big and tough as possible. And that signal is, I mean, it's two things, right? It's enhancing these features of formidability. It's making you look tougher, and it's you very readily interpret that. You as the target of anger look at that person and say, wow, he's angry now. He's going to hit me if I keep this argument up. And so those two things can coexist, the signal of I'm angry and the enhancement of formidability, right? They do coexist. But if you want to explain the origin of this, like where does it come from? Why is it people stand tall when they're angry as opposed to hunched down? Why is it that they have an anger face that looks the way it does? Why not the opposite? Why do we lower our eyebrows when we're angry rather than raise them? And we do raise them sometimes when we're arguing in a non-violent way, but never mind that for now. When you're in a case of violent anger, and when you're getting ready to hit someone, two guys yelling at each other in a bar, the eyebrows go down, right? And the lips get tightened and raised, the cheekbones often will go up, the nose will flare, the chin bun will flex, and so on. You have this kind of coordinated set of features to the face. And what this is doing, I've argued, and I have some data to back this up, is that you're coordinating, you're changing all the features that formidability assessment mechanisms perceive. So you look at tall people and see them as more dangerous than short people. So when you're angry, you stand taller. Right? You look at people who have broader chests, bigger chest is more stronger. So when people get angry, they puff their chest up, they inflate their lungs to give the illusion of a larger chest. We look at people with a more robust brow ridge, squarer jaw, thinner lips, wider nose, higher cheekbones as more physically strong. And so when you get angry, you change all of those and you create this anger expression. People with louder voices, with lower pitched voices may sound stronger. And those change. People start yelling and so on when they're angry. So these changes, the argument anyway is that they're not random. That they're changes to cues of formidability so that you make yourself seem as strong as possible through every channel you're being assessed in during anger. And so that sets up a kind of arms race with the perceiver, because the perceiver should look at this person and say, well, yes, they're standing taller now, but they were shorter a second ago. And, they sound really intimidating now, but they weren't so much beforehand. So in theory, the people who perceive this may discount it a bit. On the other hand, and so here's the problem. If those signals are lies, right, because you're changing the way your face looks, you're changing the way your body looks, if they're completely non-predictive of formidability, what will happen over evolutionary time is that perceivers will start ignoring them because they're not predictive. So if height is not predictive of how tough you are because people can change their height when they're angry, it'll go away. But that's not true, right? That's not actually what's happening. A short man doesn't look like a giant when he gets angry. He looks a little bit taller, right? His face looks a little bit more robust. And so as long as the end product of these signals are still accurate, as long as an angry person, a strong person who's angry at you still looks taller and tougher and all that than a weak person who's angry at you, then the perceptual mechanisms will still evolve to use these cues. They'll still respond to them. You'll still look at the person and say, wow, he does actually look pretty tough. Maybe I shouldn't do that.
Right. Okay. So my speculation that the formidability assessment was sort of counteracted the effects of the anger. You're suggesting that maybe isn't true because of these sort of postures and gestures that create a sense of the enhancement of the formidability, whether that's actually true or not. Is that right?
And I do think it would have to be true on average again, or else it would go away. And so yeah, that's right. I think again you can steal a lot of this from evolutionary biology. If you want to know why lions bare their fangs during aggression, right? It's because lions are presumably looking at fang length and responding to that, right? Why else would you make your fangs look really large when you're about to attack someone?
Yeah. So it's an evolutionary process we're living through now. We'll see, we'll see how it all plays out. We'll see if we're around long enough to see how it plays out. So I wanted to close off with asking you some sort of broader questions. I always like to end with sort of a broader sort of social perspective type questions.
Okay.
And I had a couple I wanted to ask you about. So one thing that struck me is that as I was preparing for our talk today, I was thinking about the fact that there seems to me to be something going on in popular culture these days around anger management. And one hears a lot about road rage and office rage, and courts are mandating anger management for people. And I did a little research, and there's actually several national organizations in the United States, practitioners who engage in this, right? So I began to think, what's going on here? And a couple of possibilities occurred to me. So I want to run two possibilities by you, and then you can respond to those, and maybe you have a better explanation than either of these. But two things that occurred to me was that this might be an instance of a kind of adaptation environment mismatch. And for listeners who may not be familiar with this, I mean, this is this idea that certain adaptations may have been beneficial back in what I guess we call the EEA, the Environment of Evolutionary Adaptation, when they were sculpted by evolutionary selective forces. Something like the famous example, of course, being the sweet tooth that, at that time would have motivated us to make the effort and take the risk to get access to fairly scarce, nutritious foods that were quite sweet. But today, when we're living, after the agricultural revolution, after the industrial revolution, now these foods are so widely available that this adaptation can become sort of counterproductive because it's so easy to get this food, and now everyone's eating too many sweets, and there's diabetes, and there's tooth decay and obesity and blah blah blah, right? Mm-hmm. So one explanation might be that anger is outlived its purpose, right? Somehow in the modern world it no longer is beneficial, and it has some sort of negative impact, and this is a response to that. Now, the second explanation I'm going to offer is that, and regular listeners to the show will know that I'm a big fan of Richard Alexander. And one thing I learned from Alexander is whenever one group of people start wagging their fingers sanctimoniously at other people, something's going on here, right? So, another possibility I'm thinking is that, well, maybe what this is that, and of course, I have to remind listeners we're talking about unconscious, evolved adaptations at work here. Not that people are deliberately doing this, but maybe the people who are not so formidable and don't get the benefits of anger are using moral norms, suasion, social institutions to try and disarm the people who would actually get the benefits of the anger if they were free to use it. So this almost is reminiscent of Christopher Baum's argument about how we evolved towards a certain egalitarianism, political egalitarianism, insofar as we're evolved to sort of put down alphas, right? So I'm wondering if something like that might be going on. So I'll throw those out as two possibilities, and if you think any of those make sense, or if you have some other explanation. But what's going on with this anger management thing?
No, that does make a lot of sense. It actually reminds me of when I was in graduate school, I was looking up quotes about anger, all these famous quotes by philosophers and so on, and I couldn't find any that were good. They all thought anger was this horrible thing, and I'm sitting around reading these people like Aristotle, Plato, Ben Franklin. These are all fools. Why don't they see that anger has a purpose and is actually useful? And the reason was that when you think of anger, and you're not thinking of your own anger, right? And statistically, the anger that you see, your own is only going to be a small fraction of that, right? You see more people than yourself. And so anger is often a source of annoyance when you're a third party, and a source of danger when you're the target, and so on. So if you think of anger broadly, the last incident of anger you saw was probably, something happening in public that annoyed you and kind of, distracted you from what you were doing. So yeah, I think what's happening here is that, and it's similar to what Christopher Baum argues, is that when you look at the selection pressures around a third party, someone who's witnessing a bout of anger between two people within their own group, how does that impact you? And the answer is, it generally impacts you negatively, because two individuals in your group who may be useful to you and whose other activities may be beneficial to you are instead squandering their effort fighting with each other, right? So in this case, just think of a simple example from work, right? If you have two colleagues at work who fight all the time, right? That annoys you, it interrupts your conversations, it slows down your productivity, it prevents them from working. And what are they fighting about? If they're fighting about something really important, like, I don't know, one of them tried to sleep with the other one's wife or something like you could relate to and think, well, that's, I'd be angry too. That's fine. But people tend to fight, or often fight, over things that appear trivial, usually because they're fighting about respect, not about the trivial nugget of whatever it is they're fighting over, or appear to be fighting over. And so if people are fighting over what you perceive as trivial actions, then it's inflicting a cost on you too, right? And therefore, it can be condemned, right? People can get together and say, look, let's resolve this. An easy way to resolve it, right, is to have them fight it out. You want one thing, he wants the other thing. Okay, fine. You guys fight each other. We'll stop you before anyone dies, and then whoever wins gets it, right? This is kind of, an old school rule for resolving these issues.
Very biblical.
Yeah. There was a wisdom to it, right? I have the sense, I probably shouldn't say this on the air, but you look at the Middle East and you think, what can possibly ever go right? It's been 40 years, right? I've watched this for almost 40 years, and nothing's ever really solved it. Maybe fighting is the answer. Everyone keeps trying to stop. Anyway, don't ask me about politics. I'm not qualified.
I'll give you I'll tell you what. You can sleep on that. If you want me to edit it out, let me know. Okay.
We've tried everything else, right? No one's tried. Yeah. So, anyway, I'm being facetious, obviously, but there's a sense there, right? It actually does work to resolve as a way of resolving it. And another way, a better way even, is to have, both people give their case, have an objective third party who isn't as biased towards one or the other. Ideally, what you get is someone like a relative in their lineage who's higher up, who's equally related to both of them. This is one explanation potentially for why elders are seen as arbiters of fairness. But they could determine, who gets it and who doesn't, and then they can stop fighting about it. So I think other people's anger is a drain on third parties, and I think third parties kind of condemn that, perhaps more so than they should, but who knows. But it's in their best interest to prevent these kind of minor squabbles from impacting the group's effectiveness and ultimately their own survival and well-being and so forth. So I think this is why anger management is pushed on people who often don't want anger management. There's a different question of why people might lose control themselves and want to get their own anger under control. But.
Sure. No, of course, that's a different thing. Yeah. Okay, so that's interesting. So for the last question, then I want to and you kind of just gave me a great little segue there, because I was going to say up till now we've been talking about this at sort of like the interpersonal level, and I think it's easy for one to see how the examples we've given would play out sort of in sort of the interpersonal politics of the street or the classroom or the workplace,
Mm-hmm.
But I'm just wondering what if you've thought about, or what research has been done, or if there's any thought to do any research about how these mechanisms play out at the level of national and international politics. Because one thing that would strike me, would seem fairly obvious, is that a people, whatever that means, was who are feeling, for whatever reason, it's bad economic times, or they're afraid of some external enemy or something, they might, if they're electing leaders, then these mechanisms of formidability assessment might come into play, and they might actually want to choose physically strong leaders in the hope that they'll be politically strong or something. Is there any work done around this kind of thing?
Yeah, I think there's something exactly like that. I'm not sure the state of publication. The person you should ask is Michael Bang Petersen at Aarhus University in Denmark. He's a collaborator of mine. We've worked on some political data. But yeah, that sort of thing is extremely reasonable from an evolutionary point of view, that when you're selecting actors, you can, or selecting leaders, you should take into account these kind of local circumstances. Michael Price also in England, right. Michael E. Price, right. does research in this area as well. So yeah, the argument's very solid, right, that you have a cost when you elect very powerful leaders. One of it is that they often extract benefits for themselves. But on the other hand, they often stand up to enemies, right? This is, I think, easily kind of the appeal of Trump, which is that, sure, he's kind of a badass and a little bit of a narcissist, and he's not the nicest guy in the world, but he's going to stick it to our enemies, right? This is how he campaigns. And so if you think America is weak and has been treated badly, then, that's a more reasonable choice. But, so, for those of you who are wondering, that's at least an argument that can be made. That's the argument he makes in his favor, right? That he's going to stand up to the various enemies of America, which, I don't know, China's lumped in there for some reason. I didn't really think of them as an enemy, but people do, so, yeah, it makes more sense to them, I imagine.
But do you think people perceive him as actually physically strong?
Well, I mean, he's physically stronger than Hillary Clinton, but...
He's a big guy, I guess.
Yeah, no, he's not weak.
Yeah.
But,
no, I'm thinking of my understanding is like Mussolini and Stalin. These guys used to take great pleasure in demonstrating their physical power, right?
We don't have to go back that far, right?
Yeah. Well, I'm sure. No,
Putin's doing the same thing, right? Putin has all these pictures.
Yes, exactly.
Guns
Good
and
example.
the biceps and so on. Yeah.
Good example. Yeah.
No, I mean, this is fairly standard for leaders to pose in war regalia.
Yeah.
No, I think exactly that. I think is the case, and more importantly, anthropologists have demonstrated, time and again, that status in hunter-gatherer societies and foraging societies positively correlates with fighting ability, and in some cases, massively so. So John Patton has done. Anthropologist John Patton did some work on with the Shuar, where he demonstrated that if you ask the Shuar who the best warriors are, and then you ask them who were the most respected people, the most respected men, it's the same question. They correlated like 0.9. And so, and that's fairly routine. Laura Betzig wrote about this long ago, that the males in high positions of power are often, they're not random with respect in terms of body size. They're strong, tough, big men. Right? So, and particularly in times of war, that would make more sense, I think. I mean, there's a lot of... the body size dimension of warfare is really fascinating. I'm actually just finishing up a war paper now on it's replicating an effect I published a while ago, which was that physically stronger men are generally more pro-war is a kind of inappropriate term for U.S. citizens, right? They're not. It's hard to find a U.S. citizen who's pro-war randomly, right? It's just invade anything, I don't care. But regardless, right? They have they're. When it came to Iraq, they supported, when it came to Afghanistan, they supported, Vietnam, we could have won that, these sorts of attitudes. And that they tend to be clustered in stronger men rather than weaker men. That weaker men tend to look at the war on terror, for example, and say, we're just going to piss them off, right? We bomb them, we're just making more terrorists. Strong men look at it and say, we're bombing them, right? They're dying. They're not going to want to sign up for that. And both are extremely reasonable arguments, right? Anger motivates people towards terrorism, or hatred does, but fear motivates them away from it, right? And bombing people both creates hatred and fear. So which one is stronger? I have no idea. But the intuitions that people have seem to stem, or correlate at least, the intuitions that men have correlate with their upper body strength. Stronger men think the war in Iraq was a better idea than do weaker men. And we've replicated that in a couple of countries now.
That's, and I guess I'm thinking too, like, I guess the relative absence of women as sort of heads of state, I think a lot of people probably think that the explanation for this is sort of like Victorian attitudes that women are not rational or too emotional or something like that. But, I wonder to what extent it's actually just, that don't have the physical strength to appeal to that sort of unconscious, I want that kind of leader thing. I wonder to what extent is that the story?
I'm not an expert in the area. I haven't seen any...
No, we're truly speculating here.
Okay, yeah, as long as that's on the record, I am very happy to speculate. Yeah, I don't know of any data showing that women are more emotional than men, so I think it's... But there's plenty of data that the... I understand you're not saying that. I'm just... I'm agreeing with you. But the emotions may very well work differently in men and women. That's very plausible. And so I think if I had to predict about politics, it's not just that women aren't elected as politicians as frequently. I do think they face a more uphill battle there because when people think of leaders, they think of strong men, and presumably have for quite a long time. It's hard to find. I don't think anyone's ever found a society where the politics is run, particularly like intergroup politics between groups, is run primarily by the women. If someone's found it, post it somewhere, I'd love to know it. But I think there's another part too, which I think, given that assuming that's true, and assuming that's been true for hundreds of thousands of years, what you'd predict is that politics should be less interesting to women, right? Because they don't really ancestrally they didn't have that kind of control, so what would be the point of learning about it and paying attention to it? Internal politics may be very interesting, but the kind of politics between groups, and it's certainly been that's certainly been my experience, and not just my experience, but the voting rolls. If you look at simple surveys that ask voters, have you been following the election closely? Men will say yes more so than women will. There's a Gallup poll on this recently, actually, or a Pew poll. And so, yeah, politics to a large extent caters, or men are more likely to follow politics than women are. And presumably that's changing, I think, a bit, but it's still the case. And I suspect there's something about that there's John Tooby once said that politics are soap operas for men. It's like, if you actually look at what politics are, they're very rarely about issues, right? They're about who said what about whom. Essentially gossip just writ large.
Yeah, I guess we don't want to go too far down this path of speculation, but I suspect that I've suspected that maybe the real explanation there has to do with parental investment theory and that the male need to have high risk and high prominent sort of strategies lead males probably to be more involved in public life, so that as public life becomes more political, men are just naturally there more than women, that sort of thing. But I think that's along the line. Probably not incompatible with the kind of thing you're speculating on too. But let's stop the speculation. So I've kept you plenty of time. So just to wrap up, maybe I'll give you one last statement. If you could sort of speak to the general public and correct any errors or what you'd like the general public to understand anger, which you think they probably don't understand. What would be your closing words on that?
That's one of the sad things about evolutionary psychology, is that our work is often just we understand the complexity of what's already there. And I think compared to something like social psychology, where there's this assumption that people are kind of almost born blank slates and they have very little there, and so the research is steps ahead of the human, and that we're going to teach the general public how to do things right. And evolutionary psychology is kind of the reverse. It's discovering that the human is already 12 steps ahead of us, and we're trying to catch up and figure out how these things actually work. So yeah, I would, in terms of general pronouncements, anger is an extrememely complex functional adaptation, right? If you're angry, there's probably a reason for it. People will often tell you they're being angry for silly reasons. Consider their advice, right? But oftentimes when you're angry about something silly, it's because there's a pattern of mistreating you. And if there's a pattern of mistreating you, anger is perfectly appropriate, even if what was done recently was relatively small. That said, recognize also, and importantly, that anger was designed for an ancestral world that was much more violent than it is today. And ancestrally, many more people died in violence, sometimes anger-based violence. And so anger can get the better of you. It can make people much more aggressive than is reasonable in modern contexts, and that people disrespecting you in the past meant that you were less likely to eat, that your children were more likely to be killed, that your wives or husbands would be more likely to be seduced. It could lead to some really bad things. If someone disrespects you now, almost nothing bad will happen to you. You'll have a little bit of a bad day, but unless there's somebody in your personal life, they're harmless, right? A person on the road who cuts you off slightly increased your chance of getting an accident. You're not going to see him again. It's not worth getting raged about. So yeah, the only point of applied research, I would say, would be recognize what anger is. It's a very powerful emotion that has a function, but also recognize you live in a different world than it evolved in. And so I would not recommend getting angry at strangers. You're going to get angry at strangers, so I wouldn't recommend acting on that anger. It's very rarely useful and can often lead to some bad events. So unless you're standing up for someone who can't stand up for themselves, being vengeful to strangers is probably not a good idea.
My guest today has been Aaron Sell. Aaron, thanks for being on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Okay, take care. Bye.
So that's today's show. Thanks for listening. The Biological Realist podcast is available on YouTube, but we'd encourage you to come to our homepage. That's Michael McConkey, Michael, McConkey, McConkey.com/The Biological Realist Podcast. If you come there, you can find a full inventory of all the shows that we've done and show pages that give you more information on the various guests. Plus, you have the opportunity to support the show by either making donations or buying products through Amazon that, at no extra cost to yourself, can generate commissions that help us keep the show on the air. So, thanks very much for listening, and watch out for us next time. We look forward to see you in the next episode of The Biological